So, thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to talk about some little bit different reptiles, the dinosaurs with feathers. And I'm gonna take you to a voyage of many, many projects, and I must warn you in advance of every one of these projects I could talk the rest of the afternoon. So I'll try to keep myself in check and stay on topic and then fly over all of these different topics. But I'm going to start with a small reflection of putting things into the scene. Firstly, where I'm from. I work at the Marlow bird park. We're a very small bird park. We have different birds, and I think we're mostly famous for one visitor. It was last year, and we did starve the lorikeets for one day so that they really came to her. That meant they were very bitey. But what Marlow is not so well known for is that they have multiple projects around the world. We have more than 40 projects that we support in different ways. And for us, an important way to support projects is technical or networking support. And we believe very much that the conservation is one of the main reasons for why we exist. And supporting conservation projects and doing conservation projects is what we do the daily work for. That's why we have the visitors, so this can run. And this brings another question: what are zoos doing for conservation? What are zoos thinking about concerning conservation? And we have, of course, a structure. We have, from Switzerland, made in Switzerland, from Heini Hediger, we have the 4 pillars of the zoos. And these are very established for us. These are even within the European legislation, a fixed concept of the legislation or the permitting for zoos. And the pillars are recreation, you have a lovely day out, it's research, it's conservation, and it's education. In the past, we have been discussing a little bit about which of these pillars might be more important. And what I've often heard is that if you are working in construction, you know this, one pillar cannot be bigger than the others, otherwise the house might get into trouble. So this led me to maybe now the pillars from Heini Hediger, they are now 45 years old. So it's led to the thought, you know, maybe if we rethink the concept just slightly, because I think zoos are a strong and valid foundation in itself. The zoos are the places where these things often have the opportunity to grow from. And then on the foundation of the zoos, we put the pillar of recreation. That means engagement and business. That means we have funding and we have abilities to work. It's research, which is the basis of which we make our decisions. Scientifically run zoos have to make decisions not of gut feelings, but of really sound evidence. It's education, which is also advocacy. And I think it was very much what Casper told us today. It's also bringing up topics that you not always want to hear. And then it's sustainability, because the sustainability we heard about today as well, in our populations of animals, in our role model function to our visitors, when we talk about using our resources on the planet. And on top of all of these pillars, we have the conservation, what we're all working towards. Conservation, or well-being in the sense, well-being for nature, for species, for communities, and for individuals. So this is maybe a slightly revised vision of what we're doing and how we're doing our work. Now we're coming to the birds. So the Passeriformes is a mega diverse order of vertebrates. If we look at all the birds in the world, the Passeriformes are about 60%. So we're talking about more than 6,000 different species of birds. And if we start calculating their known and recognized subspecies, it's nearly 20,000 different taxa. And in many cases, these subspecies are valid conservation units. If we look at the threat of the songbirds, we're fortunate that as you can see, only 18% of all the songbird species are threatened with extinction. Most of them are not threatened. But since we're talking with a mega diverse order of birds, these 18% are still more than 1,000 threatened species. So it gives us a certain responsibility, but it also presents a huge challenge of maintaining an overview and understanding the problems and the dynamics of populations of more than 1,000 species. Songbirds themselves are nearly globally distributed. They are very, very diverse, from ravens to kinglets. You have them in adaptations in mountains or in deserts. And literally, they are nearly everywhere. And in many places where songbirds occur, they are a barometer of the condition of our environment. So the songbirds are literally the canary in the coal mine for our planet. Likewise, killifish and snails. Within the European Zoo Association, EAZA, we have a strong mandate for conservation, and this is a call that comes out of the membership. EAZA is a membership organization where the direction and the focus of the organization has been continuously going towards the conservation as the main focus. But it's also an organization, it's like a branch organization of zoos and very diverse institutions that do work together on many issues, starting of course with the sustainability of their animal collections. All of this is driven and guided by many structures and rules and standards which EAZA zoos are obliged to follow. They also produced magazines and journals which are also open source and available. And within this whole structure, which will be a presentation in itself, so I'm gonna move on, but is, for instance, the EAZA Songbird Tax and Advisory Group. And the Songbird Tax and Advisory Group is the organization within EAZA which is responsible for the songbirds, say the passerines, within the zoos, but also the conservation works that the zoo does outwards. And about 10 years ago, we became very focused and concerned about the situation in Southeast Asia in particular, with several songbird species continually going towards extinction due to a overuse, due to a unsustainable trapping of the birds in the wild. Back then, 10 years ago, we were a small group of nerds, usually allowed only to be in the basement together with Gerardo and others working with non-mammals. Here you see from one of our private meetings. And we got the fine idea that we're going to have a campaign about songbirds to bring this problem to the attention, not only of the general public, but also our colleagues in the zoos. EAZA has these conservation campaigns every 2 years. And usually they focus on a very complex or a big topic, pole to pole. Some years ago focused on the energy crisis and the climate crisis. Let It Grow was about the diversity of biodiversity, even in your backyard. Issues like bushmeat and large carnivores. And we brought in the songbirds to the equation, and surprisingly our proposal was approved. Here a little bit about the background. So the Southeast Asian songbird species are very diverse, especially because Indonesia is right there in the middle with multiple islands. And songbirds are domestically being utilized for the local markets. They're being used in merit releases, so they're religious entities within the whole of Southeast Asia who actually like to, at ceremonies, release birds. Now, if you have something to release, you have to catch it first. And many of these ceremonies rely entirely on birds that are captured just for the purpose of releasing them. More about that later. Then there's the general songbird, the pet trade, where thousands of birds change hands, very modern IATA standard transport boxes here, paper bags. And we know, meanwhile, because studies have been done, that 1/3 of the households just in Java alone keep songbirds. And that's millions and millions of small birds in small cages. And there's lots of evidence on this. Much of this has occurred in the last few years, but we have a repository of more than 300 scientific papers on this topic. So it's well documented. It's not just an idea of those guys in the basement anymore. And if we look at the reasons for keeping birds, as I said, there's the pet trade. This guy Aeneas is very proud about his bird. He's not hiding it. It's not, for him, it's not wrong to keep it in a cage. He's enthusiastic about it. Here we have a Buddhist ceremony where birds are being bought. And in these, let's see how this works. Here we go. That's a little tricky. In these white crates, there's white eyes. And these white eyes, each of these crates has between 60 and 100 white eyes in it. And this person is probably a wealthy businessman, and for a religious ceremony, he has bought 6 boxes, 6 crates of white eyes, which are then in the city in Bali, in Denpasar, being released. They're basically being thrown out of the box because the first ones you release by hand, the last ones you just basically throw out. Meanwhile, in those regions, white eyes can hardly be found in the wild anymore. So they are bringing in white eyes from other islands, from Borneo or even further far in the Moluccan Islands. And that means that they're actually not only trapping the birds to be released, they're also releasing them afterwards in the wrong place, in the wrong habitat. Probably none of the birds survive, and if they do, they pose a danger for the native ones. So it's really a big issue, and behind it is the background behind it is that the people really, really like birds. So it's ironic in many ways. We had an opportunity to visit some of the sport behind it, because there's big events, and here's Theo Parkelos Cologne Zoo. We were a small delegation going around, and we met the judges at a local bird singing contest event. And this is something that happens every weekend in most small jurisdictions. And the people have their pet birds. They compete with each other about the best singer. And if you win the local competition, then you can maybe be eligible to participate in the regional participation, and the best of the best go to the President's Cups once a year, and that's where the big prize money is paid. You can win a car, you can win a house even. They don't gamble on the birds, but they speculate about them. So if your bird is successful, then the price, the value of this bird rises enormously, and that leads to a precedence case where people see, okay, this guy, he made a lot of money with his bird, and they also want the bird. And I met a guy in Nias who was actually qualified for the President's Cup, and he won the President's Cup, and he had completely decided before that he is not going to sell his Sharma thrush, just a little, very common bird in the trade. But it was so good that he got big offers, and a guy came over and said, I'll give you a car for the bird. And he thought, no, I'm not going to do it. So he returned, I'll take a Range Rover, nothing else. And now he's the only person on Nias who has a Range Rover. So you can imagine what kind of precedence this makes, how many hundreds of thousands kids who sees this goes out in the forest and try to get their own bird. We have some large bird breeders association in Europe, and some of the largest have about 10,000 members. This one in Java for breeding these shamas has 150,000 members. So it's a huge topic in Indonesia. And the markets are loud, and if you're an outsider, you don't really recognize who's winning. The judges underneath, they're putting the flags on the birds that sings the loudest, the most obvious. And in the end, everybody's happy, but these judges, they do claim about themselves that they're only uncorrupt officials in Indonesia. They are not taking any bribes for choosing. And there's clubs that compete against each other. There's merchandise you can buy. You even have at small events, you have military presence or military police presence, because the clubs do go into fierce combats with each other. Everything you need, from even if it's in a forested area, you can buy special purchase for your birds. You can buy freshly harvested ant eggs or a number of different food. We did have some of this food examined. My colleague at Chester Zoo, Andrew Owen, found out that much of this bird food that are being offered in very smart bags are actually just repacked koi food. We're trying to understand the market, and this isn't part of the background why we made the campaign. We're analyzing which species are being traded, which trends are there, and what are the interests of the consumers. And we're finding out when a species become more and more expensive, but less and less common in the market, it's a very good indicator of a very bad situation in the wild. And there is fashion that occurs. So recently the larks have come into the trade as a very interesting, become very interesting for the market. And the Javan subspecies of the horse-filled lark is nearly extinct now, and they do sing a little bit different than the subspecies from other islands. But the only one who tells us that are actually the dealers, because we don't have any recordings of the species from Java. This is something of the things you pick up. These are all shama thrushes. The dealers in this case have left them outside in the sun while they were negotiating the price, and 300 dead shama thrushes were not possible to be saved anymore. And this is all processes, all things that you pick up when you examine these markets. The epicenter of these markets are in Jakarta. You have the biggest bird market there in the world. You have the main arrival point from all over the Southeast Asian region, in particular the larger Sunda Islands, Sumatra and Borneo is high in the focus. And within there, Medan and Yogyakarta, but also in Manila in the Philippines, or in Hanoi, or in Taiwan, there's a large trade interest. And then the triangle between Thailand and China and Vietnam is a focus area, not only for turtles and other things, particularly also for songbirds, rhino horn, things like that. And that affects, because many of these birds are migratory birds, so it affects in essence the whole Asian region, far into Siberia, where populations are being affected by a massive overconsumption. And recently we've been finding increasing number of African species in the Javanese bird market. So species are now being imported from Africa to fill the market demands. We've also had some curious cases. So these are Javan endemic Java sparrows, which you will even see here at AQUATIS. But we were wondering about this case because in those enclosures there are color mutations, and we thought, okay, that seems to be really captive bred and not taken from the wild. And I had the opportunity to examine some of these birds and look at the rings, and the birds had Dutch breeders' rings. But they were selling the birds for a price between 6 and 20 euros for one bird. And we're really wondering, how are they able in Indonesia to import birds from Europe and then sell them there in the market for a low sum of money, which is way lower than the amount of money that they would be sold for here in Europe? Well, it seems there are quite some import from the European breeders as well. They're being collected around, so all the surplus from private breeders are being collected by wholesalers, who then export large numbers of birds to Indonesia. And in return, they receive birds from Indonesia, which are really rare in Europe. So the commodity becomes birds, and thereby this deal can happen. But in fact, the trade, even though it seems open and it runs all the time, it's not legal. And there are some confiscations happen now and then, but enforcement is a real problem because it happens really all the time. In the back of this car, there's 8,000 larks. And we had the opportunity to really engage with the Indonesian authorities. And here's Theo Pagel handing over the Carnival Medal of Cologne City to the Minister of Environment. And we had this meeting in 2017 where we were sitting and talking about songbird conservation, and they should put more songbirds on the list of their protected species in Indonesia. And we didn't really realize that they were accepting this, but the minister sent us into a little working group session with some of her officials in the ministry. We were talking about songbirds, and the first thing we heard back was, yeah, but you know you have problems also in Europe. And that became very obvious for me. Yes, it's true. Songbirds are also from Indonesia, and songbirds are even coming to Europe. And there is unregulated trade. It's not 8,000 larks in the back of a car, but it still happens. So we realized that before we can go to Indonesia and tell them what to do, that we also need to be very careful and taking care of our own backyard and make sure that we have our problems at least within our scope and understanding. Maybe we cannot solve all of it, but we shouldn't be neglecting it completely. What happened was that the Indonesian government suddenly put 100 songbirds on their protected list, which we were all excited about. It led to a big problem in Indonesia because it was election year, so there were 10,000 of bird dealers, illegal bird dealers mostly, who went on the street protesting against the new protected species list. And we got a call from the government of Indonesia and said, here, you EAZA, you told us what to do, now solve it. So we had to write a scientific statement to this whole issue and try to solve the problem. In the end, it became a bargaining, as it often does in the politics. 100 species went onto the protected list, 5 species were taken off again. But in the end, it was a compromise, which was a very good development. So, that led us, however, to the thought we also need to watch out for the trade which is going on at home. And we developed an EAZA position statement on our view of unsustainable trade, and we've developing this beyond above and beyond the level of the legislation. So for EAZA members, member institutions of EAZA, the trade has not only to be legal and sustainable, but it also has to be ethical. So if a species is protected in another country, we cannot just say here, well, now it's here, we can do whatever we want, because here it's not protected. We need to, even if the legislation doesn't support that, EAZA members are obliged to, when it comes to songbirds. We also have, in the course of all that, we developed a motion at the UICN meeting, so there's a motion on that, and later I'll talk more about the work we've done with CITES. But how do we represent the hundreds and hundreds of species in the trade in a campaign for the European zoos? There's so many species that are affected by the trade, but we did decide on a small group of 6 species, which was then our ambassadors for the program, our ambassadors for the campaign. And I myself work with the hill miners, that's the one in the top in the middle. And the hill miners themselves are a complex of species and subspecies. Alone in Indonesia, there's a more than a handful of subspecies. There's a large size variation. And if you look at some of the species here, the critically endangered Nias hill miner, where the population is around 250 to 300 birds, and the endangered Tenggara hill miner, where we think the population is about 1,500 birds. These 2 species used to be considered the same species, But in the course of our work, and if you look at the images, there's very little doubt that these should be considered the same species in the same conservation unit. So we already have a mega diverse group, and it just keeps growing because we keep discovering new species or conservation units. We found out that the time is running away from us. We're losing time in terms of saving species, which for some of them there are quite suitable habitats. Many of these species will occur in secondary habitat, and they do not have problems being in gardens or in cities. But when they're being trapped out at a high rate, then they quickly disappear completely. And for some species, it is so bad that we need to, as has been mentioned a few times today, we need to buy time so that after behavior change or other solutions, protected areas fall in place, we still have a population that we can introduce or we can maintain. So one of these breeding centers we've set up in the course of the campaign is the Breeding Conservation Arc, which has meanwhile some 250 aviaries. They have expanded into fish and mammals as well. But here some of the more difficult small songbirds like white-eyes are being bred in aviaries, and we maintain the populations over time, potentially over generations, until we have a solution to release them in a protected site or with a community engagement that ensures that kind of protection. And we've also ventured into some species that are traditionally extremely difficult to keep and breed, like the leaf birds. In NIAS, we had a project that we were supporting, which is for the NIAS hill myna. This is my baby, so that's of course why I was very involved with that. We set up breeding facilities in the site, but mainly we wanted to engage the public in NIAS. So we made a pride campaign, making this bird the national bird of the island, and we found an unusual partner in the natural, not in the natural history, but the Natural Heritage Museum, which was looking at researching and maintaining the cultural history of the island. And they quickly found out that the colors of the NIAS hill myna, the magiao, which is called traditionally there, were also found in some of their history. So we could tie into that, and we could make a whole local excitement about these birds. And it was locally that these birds were still kept in cages, but were as good as gone from the forest. So setting up the campaign, talking to the children at the zoo, the mini zoo they have there, showing them the birds, led to enthusiasm about the species, but it also led to people in the public who kept these birds. They would come to the museum with their bird and say, yeah, take it, save the species. So we suddenly got birds brought to us and could start a breeding program with those. So a contract was signed, and in consequence of all that, at the next governor's election, the NIAS hill myna became the mascot of the island, and it still is. Another side event was the Zoo Animal of the Year, which you have in the German-speaking zoos, where the hill myna was the Zoo Animal of the Year in 2020. Then we have the breeding center at the orangutan heaven in Sumatra. The orangutan heaven is also supported by several zoos, but also from the Swiss organization Paneco. And it is, unfortunately, very focused on these monkeys, but we are doing our best to change this slightly. So we have managed to convince the sponsors, but also the organization behind it, the SOCP, to develop something for songbirds. And we have a facility there for orangutans. We have a little bit of space for songbirds, but we have an infrastructure. They have veterinarians, they have staff, they have security. So we have now a first songbird breeding center in Sumatra as well. Also close to Sumatra, we had the Treasure Island, and I'm showing you all of these projects because these are the projects that we supported with the campaign. And the project we supported with the campaign is the core essence of such a campaign. This is where all our stories turn around. This is where this is the purpose for our fundraising and so forth. The Treasure Island, of course, we didn't disclose the real name of this island during the campaign because it was home, or is home, to the last surviving Nias hill miners in the wild. And this is the westernmost island. I already gave away where it's from, but it's in the Indian Ocean. It's not very easily accessible, and in here in the forest we have the last surviving Nias hill miners. It's also an important island for the Indian Ocean population of the leatherback turtles, which are also critically endangered. And our project supported the rangers on the island. It's otherwise uninhabited, but the rangers are responsible for preventing any incursion into the island and any poaching. And in 2017, we managed to, 2017, we actually managed to capture poachers red-handed there, and who was sent to prison. Another project, very much funded by Chester Zoo and the Manchester Metropolitan University, was a field project looking at bird populations in Java. Java itself is a very mountainous island, so several species are adapted to mountains, and you'll only find them surviving on these peaks of rainforested mountains. And searching several mountain peaks over a course of a few months for the last remnant populations of certain species, also using listening devices, which was then analyzed using artificial intelligence. It was possible to determine the best possible sites for potential future releases of birds, or sites for specific protection needs. And going onwards, we had the Bali Miner research project, which is very much a community-based research project. The Bali Miner is interesting because this is the only songbird that we've really had programs for since a long time. They've been functionally extinct in the wild for more than 30 years, and we've been maintaining them over that time in the European zoos through the EEP program. So we're talking more than 10 generations of songbirds, and we still have a healthy populations where birds have been sent back to Indonesia, in this case to Bali, and there's a government breeding facility where birds have been replenished into the wild every year. Traditionally, it's been very much like birds have been released in September, there's been a count, 70 birds. Okay, next year in the summer, there's another count, which is not published. Mostly that's 5 birds, and then birds are being released again, and there's a published release of 75 birds. And it's been going up and down like that for almost 2 decades. But in the last 5 years, we've finally managed to get some progress going, and this study has been really instrumental for that. We've been engaging the buffer zone of the national park in Bali. We've been engaging the people who have traditionally, of course, been poaching the birds. But we've also found out that the Bali miner probably did not really survive, or do not really survive well in the habitat where they've been released in the past, which is the forested habitat. But we think now that the Bali miner is very much related to the large ruminants, the cattle that is now extinct in Bali, and the Bantang cattle, and that they like this kind of altered habitat that the large herbivores creates. Now, when the large herbivores disappears and everything goes into young forest, which is now the case, the Bali miners instinctively go to the buffer zone of the national park where there's cattle farming. So they visit the cattle farmers, which are very happy to see an increased salary by collecting a few Bali miners, which voluntarily come to them. What can they do? So engaging these people in the buffer zone has been important, because this is now the sites where the Bali miners are surviving in larger numbers, and the population is now, and that's like what Alex said, you're the first to know, population is now approaching 450 birds, which are reproducing and growing. So finally, there's a little bit of hope for the Bali miners. Cologne Zoo is running the EEP, and Chester Zoo and Lincoln Park Zoo has been important for the funding. And I'm mentioning all of these zoos because this is very much what this presentation is about. When the zoos come together and work together, much more can be achieved. Another breeding center is the Chickamauga breeding facility, where we, which is very focused on these mountainous species from Java. We have a small international team, but mostly Indonesian team, working with some of the really rare species. On top, the Javan green magpie, in the middle, the rufous-fronted laughing thrush, and below, the black-winged starling. All of these species are critically endangered. Another small island we've been looking at protecting is the Babi and Lasia Islands. These are small islands off Similor, which is in the northwestern part of Indonesia again. These islands have primary habitat. They have excellent sites for birds, but the endemic birds on these two islands have nearly disappeared completely. Again, we're talking about hill miners and white-rumped chamas. We've been engaging with this project the local communities, and particularly the fishermen, which have been using these islands as a resting place. So they go out, they fish for a whole day, then they'll overnight on these islands, catch a few birds, and they'll fish the next day, and then they'll go home. And by engaging them in discussions and support, and maybe financing also a little bit of their time for this, they're now not only started to count and report any trapping of birds, and they're actually collecting wonderful data in terms of how often, how frequently, and what prices are these birds sold at. But it's coming now to the point where they're becoming so aware that they're saying, well, we cannot continue to support this. Is there anything we can do to protect these islands? And that's where we can step in and ensure that a protection status occurs, which is decided with the communities and not over the communities. In such cases, it has hope that a protective status actually functions. And these are the two shamas we're talking about. These are endemics from those two islands and from Similor. And you can see, if you just go back, you can see they look very similar. These are subspecies, but they do have variations in their song and their behavior, which make them attractive for the trade, make them attractive for the specialists in breeding shamas in Indonesia, because they just want that, what is a little bit different. And that's why these small island populations are being completely depleted. Here we have the Similor hill miner, which was long considered not a valid subspecies, but since we finally got data on the birds, it was revived in 2019 as a subspecies, and new genetic studies now suggest that they might even be so distinct that they should be considered a separate species. In Similor, we've built up breeding facilities there as well, to be able to take some of these birds from the local. In this case, the birds are not being given to us by the public in that sense, but we're working with the government who confiscates the birds. They go into the breeding center, and we're hoping very soon to be able to release the first birds into a new protected area. Slowly coming to the end of the projects. Each of these I could talk on and on about. But the Javan sparrow, which you've seen here as well, this is another community-based project. The sparrows will breed very close to rice fields, and we've, together with this organization, we've developed a program that will enable the local farmers to adopt a nest site. They get a little bit of money from the project for adopting the site, for making sure that the birds are nesting, for documenting that they're actually nesting there. And of course, this makes a local protection. They have absolutely no interest that the birds disappear out of the site, because then they get no more funding. And with that, we've been able to really maintain this last site. There are groups of people who would be happy to move in and just catch them out. They're not super expensive. They're not, because they're also being captive bred, but they're unbelievably valuable because they're the last wild populations which we have. So that's why protecting them is so essential. And then we have a rescue center in the island of Borneo. Here we have quite a few confiscations, but we have lots of problems with these birds not being handled well. Often they come into the possession of the authorities in a really poor condition, and they're being released. They cannot even fly, so they could just as well be euthanized. And this facility has just recently been set up. It was opened here at the beginning of the year, and it has a veterinary clinic, and this is our veterinarian. He is actually called Dr. Happy, here's Dr. Happy introducing the facility to the local authorities. So the idea is to set up a high standard rescue and rehabilitation center for songbirds, enabling us to release them not only in the right way, but also in many cases in the right site. And we have some social, cultural research projects looking at understanding the motivations and priorities for those who uses the birds, those who buys the birds, and why they don't care about the conservation, for instance. And how was all this possible? Well, we were doing a lot of activities with the zoos in those 2 years. So we fundraised about €500,000, which was used to support these projects. But we had these projects initiated before we did the fundraising. So it was like a dual story. We could tell the zoos who participated about the projects as ongoing, and that way we could motivate them to support it. The other thing we did was that we collected binoculars, used binoculars in the zoos, and here the oiseaux in Lübeck in Düsseldorf was absolutely the winner. They had some 300 binoculars collected, which were all tested and repaired and sent to Indonesia, so that in communities it's possible for kids to experience birds in a different way than in a cage. For doing fundraising, we also had things like, in this case, on the right side, we have 2 colleagues from the Netherlands. So it's very flat, as you know. But they went on a bicycling trip, fundraising in the French Vosges Mountains, and they actually survived. So they collect some money for the campaign. In Heidelberg Zoo, we had this wall of the rainforest, and you can buy a sticker of a bird, and like buying a bird in the market, and then you can symbolically release it in the forest. We had zoo directors making wonderful paintings of songbirds, which we could auction out at our EAZA conferences. In Cologne Zoo, they did a tattoo session where you could have your tattoo, and then instead of paying the tattooer to do this, you would donate the money, or the tattoo agency or studio would donate the money, and I think who not do want to have a Javan green magpie on your chest? I think this is the... Zookeepers were doing fantastic fundraising activities, from parties to events in zoos, motto party. I think this is a silver-eared sunbird here. The German Zoo Association, Zookeepers Association brought us money that they've collected amongst their colleagues. And zoos who participate in the campaign, and it was 192 of the 300 zoos in EAZA was participating in the campaign, and they of course received certificates for their donations. We did some merchandising. It was not a huge success, but also zoos who doesn't have Indonesian songbirds could, like Alpen Zoo here in Austria, they would have some of our merchandise in their assortment. And important part was the exhibitions and the education material. So we developed our education material in advance of the campaign, making sure it was available in multiple languages, and setting up and making it available on our website, which is still the case. So you can download all of this material for free if you want to do education with children about songbirds. And some of it is really simple. You can do very small, simple activities and interest the public about it. Doing exhibitions as well is an opportunity to talk about a topic, and if you're talking about the topic, it's also then an opportunity to fundraise for the cause. But you could ask yourself, what are the purpose of all of these exhibits within Europe, where the problem is not as big as in Southeast Asia? But in my eyes, I think these exhibits are really important for the credibility of the zoos. We need to tell the public that we're doing something and we're collecting funds for it to get their support for our activities. So the internal education and showing all of these things in different zoos have been incredibly important. There are some places in Europe where songbird trade is also still a stronger issue than you would expect. So there's parts of Italy where the redwing, a thrush, is being traded in large numbers for exhibitions, for songbird competitions, very similarly to in Indonesia. This species is globally near-threatened, and their distribution is Palearctic, but they're almost the complete world population winters in the European region. So Europe has a strong responsibility for this species. The trade and the use of the birds in Italy and other places is illegal. So the Parc Natura Viva in Italy decided to do an exhibition linked to silent forest, but about their local issues. And I was welcome to open the exhibition together with the local forest police chief, who was very excited about our activities. Some zoos had songbird days, and lots of art and performances came out of the campaign, inspired by the campaign, from acting to documentary films. And there is even a songbird circus, which you can book. It's a artist group from the UK who have completely inspired by the campaign, developed their own little circus performance. It's very emotional. There is crazy colleagues in different zoos who use the campaign also for personal events or just to be silly and do something for a shared cause. We used our annual meetings to make attention, to bring attention to the topic, dressing up as songbirds. And we've been developing our breeding programs in the zoos to really vamp up our activities for those songbirds which are kept in European zoos, or those which we keep that serve as potential model species for the breeding centers that I mentioned before. So best practice guidelines, knowledge gathering about these species have been instrumental to enable the captive breeding in our supported facilities in Indonesia. So how is all this going to continue in the future? This is sort of our vision statement. You don't have to read it, but we believe that through education, through understanding, there is room for birds and people to live together. And this is absolutely the future. It is not possible to separate the conservation of the songbirds from people in restricted access areas. And a good example is the Javan pied starling. So this species is now completely extinct in the wild, but they still occur in quite large numbers in cages and in aviaries within Indonesia. And we have, just in the last couple of months, the first birds have been released in the wild in a trial release. This is, of course, complicated because there's a number of issues, but the main issue is that somebody from the public who sees a bird that's worth a couple of money, or a little bit of money, they actually may go out and capture them again. So the key to success is the public education within that area. We're also expanding our focus a little bit beyond just the songbirds of Southeast Asia. And I see something went wrong here, I'm very sorry. But this is the Nemosis ruri. This is the cherry-throated tanager. It's from Brazil. There's 24 left of them in the wild. Here you have the Pomerea whitney. There's 17 left of those. This is the Fatohiva monarch flycatcher. And this is the Myrtula snowy, which is the Alagoas and wren. And the known world population is now down to 6 birds. The last one we're probably going to lose in the next year or two. The cherry-throated tanager is now actually increasing thanks to conservation efforts on site. The most important factor has been that we have a team on site monitoring the nests, and whenever there's a group of capuchin monkeys or a toucan coming too close to the nest, they actually physically divert them from the nest, so the population is now growing again. And the Pomerea whitney, we're probably going to start ex situ breeding this year, and that's in French Polynesia. So we're expanding the focus, and if you look at it, these things are just supported by zoos, and if it wasn't for these zoos, the projects just couldn't function. And there's a little bit of hope. So the video in the middle, which shouldn't have been there yet, shows 2 cherry-throated tanagers being fed by the parents. That's a benefit when you have somebody guarding the nest the whole day. You get wonderful images of one of the rarest species on our planet. And I have to remind you, 24 cherry-throated tanagers, they weigh less than a single elephant tusk. You know, it's a just minute population. We do have a couple of species in Europe that needs attention as well. One is the citro finch, which is a species you'll find in the mountainous areas. They are important. Switzerland is an important place for these, and the populations are currently seemingly crashing in most areas. The Alps is where they're still doing the best, but in all fringe areas, Pyrenees or in Germany, the population is crashing, and we're seeing health issues. We're seeing parasite loads, which is not normal. And in case of the crested lark, they're a species, they're globally least concern, but there's numerous subspecies also within Europe which are endemic, and they are very, what do you call it, they're perineal species, so they'll move into new areas where the ground is open, so they're much attracted to human activities, to fields or construction sites, which will serve them as a breeding ground for a couple of years, and then they'll move to a new opened area. The trouble is that they come into cities and become prey of particularly domestic cats. And when the populations are small, and in one location in southern Germany, the population is down to a few 20 or 25 breeding pairs, and there are some pairs where they have consistently been losing all the offspring due to domestic cats for years. This year we managed, I'm advisor for this project, and this year we managed to get a restriction zone for 3 months for leaving your domestic cat outside. It was a huge issue in the German press, and I did give an interview, and I managed to catch my first death threat on Facebook, so it was very interesting. So we're adding a little bit more research to the issue. We know that songbirds are being focused on illegal trade in Southeast Asia, but we know also that Africa is coming into the equation. We're finding out that what they're doing in Southeast Asia is appealing to people in other regions. So there is in Suriname, you have Indonesian-style songbird competitions, and people are more connected now than ever before, and the songbird trade, if you like, have moved online. There are measures in place to save some of these species, and we do have some songbirds in CITES, and this one, the grey cardinal, has been in CITES for quite a long time. Recently there's been a huge hype. The species is from Brazil and Argentina, but recently there's been a huge hype about this species in Indonesia. The reason is that it's been used as a model to develop a figure from a computer game, and the trade name in Indonesia in the bird market is angry bird for this species. But it's CITES listed, and that means it's not possible to move them in large numbers. And that protects the species in the wild. Another one is the red siskin. It's a species that are being captured to crossbreed them with canaries, because if you don't, you'll never get a red canary. Because of their CITES listing, the species probably still exists. They've gone from 3 million birds to less than 1,000 in the wild in a matter of a couple of decades. And we've been looking at this use of CITES as a possible regulatory tool and a support and a protection tool for a number of species. And if you look at this graph made by BirdLife, you'll see that songbirds are 60% of the species, but they only represent 1% of their 6,000 species are CITES listed. From the other birds, all of the other birds, so all non-songbirds, 35% are CITES listed. And that's nearly all parrots, it's all birds of prey, and still we have many, many songbirds which are unprotected. We've been using the Songbird Knowledge Initiative or Songbird Knowledge Index to understanding the priorities within the songbirds. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's many, many, many species. So we need to have some help to identify how to focus our work. The Silent Forest Group, as we call ourselves, are, after the campaign, we're still the only group in the world who only focus on the passerines. And it's still a huge group, but there's no other groups. There's plenty of conservation organizations might be focused on one group or one geographical area, but this whole group doesn't have the attention. So we looked at all of the songbirds in this study, and as you can see here, this is a tree map. Every little square in the tree map represents one species of songbird. And here you can see if you run the 6,000 species through, you can quickly find out which ones are in the international trade using different markers. You can find out that out of those 1,000 something, nearly 1,998 are not in CITES, and that's the subset of the big identification. Then if you look at other risks like sensibility to climate change, or if they're, for instance, they are evolutionary distinct, then you overlay all of these information, and that gives you a clearer picture of which species you need to look much more closely at. And then you run all of that, a smaller group, through a decision tree, and it leaves you with some red dots, and these fewer red dots are much more easy to manage than looking at all the 6,000 species. And all of this has gone into a report which is now available online, which was have been supplied to CITES to consider which species should be listed maybe in the future, where it makes sense. We've developed our own database to monitor which species globally are being in the trade, and we've been combining that with data about how easy or difficult they are to breed, which gives us an indicator if some of these traded birds are being laundered, a little like that captive breeding, if it's feasible or if it's not feasible. And this leads us to identify some new issues, some species that's not been in the trade before but suddenly appears, like the butcher birds from New Guinea or the crested jays from Borneo. It gives us a picture of some species which have been in the trade for a long time. So monitoring if the species is in the trade in the same numbers, if the trend is going down. And here we have a case where the species is becoming rarer, but the price is going up. So we need to look closer if there's a bigger issue. We have species that have suddenly appeared in the trade and were not available before. And here in this case, the grey-backed myna, the world population is possibly lower than 50. During the COVID crisis, a number of online advertisements suddenly showed up advertising these birds as fresh out of the BRUSLUND National Park. And we investigated this closer, and we actually identified and unraveled a illegal trade collecting in the national park and putting them available. We could put on the map how the people were moving around. We could report this to the authorities in our publication, and it's all led to a workshop with the national park authorities, which was Indonesian-led. It was in the depth of the pandemic, and now we're expecting the first results of really closing this trade. The BRUSLUND National Park is strongly supported again by a zoo, so Copenhagen Zoo is involved in the management, so they've been supplying the team on the ground with the abilities to monitor the populations more closely. Another one we have, which I was very interesting to see the presentation from Thomas. This is the orange color, the colored laughing thrush, and this species is from the same high plateaus in Vietnam that Thomas was talking about. It's a micro-endemic, and they literally just occur in protected areas there. So you could say that's very good news. But in the last couple of years, more than a dozen of couples of these birds, we think somewhere around 40 birds have appeared in the trade in Europe. This is images from a bird dealer in Portugal. But before 2016, this species has never been in captivity. And there is an import ban into the European Union, but still the birds do show up. It's a novelty, it's rare, prices are high, and it's something to bring the attention of the authorities, and of course potentially need to close the gap of these birds leaving their original range. Last year in November was the CITES Cup in Panama, and we had the opportunity there to present our research results, but also lobby strongly for more inclusion of songbirds in CITES legislations. And the white-rumped charmer was accepted for Appendix 2, and this is a species I've been working on for 2 years or so to be submitted for CITES listing, but nobody was actually giving us a chance that this was going to happen, and so we were more than excited and thrilled that it succeeded. This is going to be this legislation development is going to make our work with the species in Indonesia and in Europe more difficult, but it's an important step to protect the species, because the international trade from Thailand and Malaysia to Indonesia to feed a huge market is just the bigger threat. So with that, I am done. I have lots of people to say thank you to. I will just leave the list, and if there's any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this really great talk. And even though it was long, but I'm sure there are questions.
Just a general question with low-rate animals, contrary as a snail from Gerardo and thousands of tape dolls or thousands of eggs. Technically, when do you consider that an in situ species is extinct? When I read that there is less than 10 animals, for me, with a low rate, vertebrate should be considered as instinct. And other part of my question, you had the experience with a blue ara, and he's well bred now in captivity. But at my knowledge, it's no more possible to have in situ wild population. So, about this experience with eventual releasing or recovery in situ, what do you think is possible or really not?
Yeah. So lots of complicated factors come into that, but it's a great question, but it's a very difficult answer. There's a hesitance of calling a species extinct, because ever again, we do see that nature is resilient, and a species we think is extinct is resurfaced somewhere. We find the last last 300 snails in an alley somewhere, or the bird shows up years after. So the cherry-throated tanager I talked about was considered extinct in the 1940s and was rediscovered in the 1990s. So it was gone for science for a while. So it shows from one side that there are limits to what we know, but on the other side, the knowledge about the wild population is ever increasing, and a species like the Javan pied starling has not been seen, and this is a species that would not naturally occur in large flocks. And the only sightings from Java in the last 2 decades has been single birds. And that's not a functional population in any way. So these are probably escapees from captive breeding. So we talk about species as being functionally extinct all the time. The one we're going to lose is the alagoas and wren. And we think that this one is going, because the areas where they live is becoming fragmented, the forests are becoming so small that the natural structure of the mixed species foraging groups are collapsing. And the larger species, they are okay because they can forage, they find enough food. But there are some small species that have been adapted to live in the company of other species that flush up insects that provides them with that added resource of food. And they are now suffering from these fragmentations enormously. So when we're talking about the rarest of the rare, it's a gamble. We don't know which one we're going to save and which one we're not, but we're definitely not going to not try. We're going to try everything we can whenever possible. In the case of the blue macaw, the Spixus macaw, this is quite a special case because it was probably already functionally extinct the first time around when the human found them the first time. I don't think this originally was a blue macaw. I think this was a green macaw. Then that inbreeding and population fragmentation have led to mutations in the population. If they can still survive in the wild is a big question, which I cannot answer.
Merci beaucoup. Autre question? Autrement, encore une fois, merci beaucoup à Simone. Aussi pour toi.